Hey guys, welcome to this video on the brain. We're going to run through some of the key information for the GCSE exam, including some key vocabulary that you need to know, the different brain areas, including the lobes, cortex areas and language areas, and then the key study for this area. So the main thing to understand is that the whole point of studying the brain is to learn about which parts of the brain are responsible for which functions. Before we did this, we believed that when a brain was completing a function, the entire brain was being used. The entire brain was responsible for that function. But since modern scanning techniques have existed and sort of lots of studying of the brain, we started to understand that it's a bit more complicated than that. And actually, it might be a case of certain brain areas have specific functions. And a lot of psychologists are responsible for studying this. And this process is called cognitive neuroscience. So in terms of defining this word, it's possible to get a short answer question on this word in the exam. I've been telling you to remember to break the word down. So you have the word science, which means the study of. You have the word neuro, which means brain, and cognitive, which means mental processes. So it's basically the study of the brain and its link with cognitive mental processes, which basically means the study of mental processes and brain and how brain areas are connected. So the short, easy way of saying it is, well, what brain area is responsible for what function? So the whole point of cognitive neuroscience is to match up which bit of the brain is responsible for what mental function, which bit of the brain is responsible for your vision, which bit of the brain is responsible for your language and things like that. Understanding that the brain has different functions is also the word localization. So this is the word that is used to describe the fact that the brain has different areas which have different functions. Before we believed in this, we did believe that the entire brain was responsible for all functions at the same time. So in terms of what you need to know about brain areas, you firstly need to know about the lobes that the brain is split into. So as you can see from this picture, we have a frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, an occipital lobe, and a temporal lobe. Now you also have a cerebellum towards the bottom there, which is responsible for a bit of movement and balance. And we have the spinal cord, which helps combine with the brain to make up the central nervous system. Now within each lobe is a key cortex which you need to know. So firstly, at the back of the frontal lobe is the motor cortex. This is responsible for controlling all muscle movement. So anytime you move your hand, legs, etc., that's the motor cortex. Just behind that, at the front of the parietal lobe, is the somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for processing any touch sensations like pain. That gets processed here. At the very back of the brain is the visual cortex. In the occipital lobe, it basically just processes all visual information, colour, distance, shape from the eyes. In the temporal lobe, we have the auditory cortex, which processes all sound information received through your ears. Each of these cortex areas is present on both hemispheres of the brain, both sides of the brain. The two language areas are only present on the left side of the brain. These language areas are in the frontal lobe, Broca's area. This is where speech is produced. A simple way of remembering this one is to sort of just say that this is where your vocabulary is stored. And if you damage this area, you won't be able to physically say very many words. And then in the temporal lobe, we have Wernicke's area, and this is where your speech is processed and understood. And it's where speech understanding and comprehension is looked after. In terms of what you could get in the exam, you could get pictures of the brain to label. You could get parts of the brain with sort of arrows pointing out of them, and you need to be able to say what cortex it's pointing to, for example. Or you could get a written question a little bit like this one, where a patient reports a loss of sensation in their right hand and arm. You need to identify which brain lobe should the psychologist investigate and why, and what could have caused this brain damage. So if they've lost sensation, that sounds like a somatosensory cortex problem. So you need to remember that that's in the parietal lobe. And then you need to justify why. Well, this is because in the parietal lobe, this is where the somatosensory cortex is, which processes touch sensations, and the patient is having difficulty with this. Cause could be anything from a stroke to a head injury to a brain infection. The key study for this area is Penfield and his interpretive cortex study. Penfield was a very famous brain surgeon of his time, and whilst he was performing brain surgeries, he took the opportunity to run a study on different cortex areas of the brain to investigate the functionality. What he wanted to do was investigate the effect of stimulating certain brain areas and find out if they would respond the way that we believed the cortex areas respond. So because he was a world-famous brain surgeon, he performed in the region of 1,000 surgeries on epileptic patients, and they had to essentially be awake while the brain surgery was happening. And whilst he was doing the surgery to help their epilepsy, he took the opportunity to apply gentle electrical stimulation to the different cortex areas to see what would happen with the participant and what they would experience. And as expected, when he stimulated each cortex area, a different reaction happened. So when he stimulated the visual cortex, the participant said they saw things. When he stimulated the auditory cortex, they said they heard things. When it was the motor cortex, the participant moved a part of their body. And when it was the somatosensory cortex, the participant felt like they were being touched. Interestingly, when he stimulated another part of the temporal lobe, some of the participants reported that they were actually reliving a really emotional memory, deep emotional memory of theirs, and this led him to believe that he'd found a new cortex area where emotional memories were stored, and he called this the interpretive cortex. Basically, in conclusion, he confirmed two things. One, that brain function is localized, as we expected, and that in the temporal lobe there is an interpretive cortex where we seem to store really emotional, deep memories and emotional feelings. In terms of evaluating the study, it's not too difficult. We can talk about the controlled scientific nature of a brain surgery, which is highly controlled, which means it can be repeated and is reliable. And this is true because he did these case studies about 1,000 times and got the same results for the cortex areas every time. As it's case studies on epileptic patients, we have a bit of a generalization problem. These epileptic brains are very different to non-epileptic brains, so the results may not generalize to non-epileptic patients. In terms of his interpretive cortex, patients only reported this about 5% of the time, and this might not be considered consistent enough to actually confirm that the interpretive cortex exists. And whilst there are lots of positive to case studies like the deep detail, the other issue is the ethical dilemma. The fact that these patients are quite rare, they might well be, it might be easier to locate them afterwards, which means it might not be as confidential as it should be. In terms of evaluating studies, I want you guys to remember the two-part evaluation in order to impress the examiners. So if you had a question like evaluate Penfield's study of the interpretive cortex, for each evaluation you need to identify the evaluation and explain why it's an evaluation. So a bit like below, you might say one issue with Penfield's study is that there are ethical issues when doing case studies. That'll get you 1 mark, but you need to keep going. You need to tell me why this is a problem. So you might say something like this is a problem, as it may be easier to identify the participant with their rare condition, and therefore it may not be kept confidential. That's much more likely to impress the examiner and get you 2 marks per evaluation. Right guys, that's everything you need to know about the brain in terms of some keywords, the key brain areas, and Penfield's key study. Feel free to pause the video now and test yourself with this picture of the brain where I have removed the labels and replaced them with letters to see if you can remember the names of the lobes, the cortex areas, and the extra brain areas.